On Thanksgiving Day, we celebrate the abundance of food and other blessings that God has given us. In the United States, we associate our Thanksgiving celebration with an event that occurred in Plymouth, Massachusetts, nearly 500 years ago. Our story begins with a group of people known as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, who called themselves saints, were Christians who lived in England in the early 1600s. England had an official church at that time, the Church of England. The Pilgrims, along with several other Christian groups, began to read the Bible and realized that some of the things the Church of England did and taught did not make sense. They wanted to form their own church and worship the way they felt the Bible taught them to worship. But they couldn't do this in England. So they decided to travel to America and join the colony of Virginia, where they could have more religious freedom. Led by a man named William Bradford, the Pilgrims planned their voyage to Virginia in the New World. They joined a group of travelers not of their faith who also wanted to travel to America. They called them strangers. In August 1620, the saints and the strangers boarded two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, and set sail for the New World. Unfortunately, the Speedwell began to leak and the ships had to return to England. This delayed their departure until the middle of the stormy season in the Atlantic and caused them to use up precious provisions. It also meant that they would have to pack everything and everyone into one ship, the Mayflower. On September 6, 1620, the overcrowded Mayflower left England once again, this time from Plymouth. The Mayflower was captained by Christopher Jones and had a crew of 25 to 30 people, in addition to the 102 passengers. The voyage was miserable. Storms were so severe that the ship was damaged and they almost had to turn back. They were able to repair the damages and continue on. The passengers suffered cramped quarters, terrible seasickness, hunger, and disease. Finally, 65 miserable days later, they sighted land. While the Pilgrims had meant to settle in Virginia, they found themselves about 500 miles north of their destination. They arrived in Cape Cod, part of modern-day Massachusetts. There was no active colony there and no government, and so they drew up an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact that served as the basic governing document of their new colony, Plymouth. An exploration party was sent ashore under the command of Captain Miles Standish. They found their landing place to be bitterly cold and unwelcoming. They were able to find an empty Native American village, but not much else. Without shelter on land, the Pilgrims were forced to endure the rest of the winter on the Mayflower. Disease soon broke out on the ship. Most of the men were too sick and weak to work, and so progress on building homes was slow. By March, nearly half of the passengers and crew had died. Many of the survivors were children. As more buildings were erected, the Pilgrims began transferring their provisions from the ship. Their new life in Plymouth was difficult and dangerous. They struggled to grow and obtain food. They also lived in constant fear of the Native Americans nearby. Relationships with the Native Americans were tense, as encounters between European explorers and the local tribes had sometimes resulted in violence. The Indians were also aware that the Pilgrims had raided their stores of corn early in the winter. In March 1621, a brave Native American man named Samoset walked into Plymouth. "Welcome, Englishmen," he said. The Pilgrims were surprised to hear him speak English and had many questions for him. They learned that the nearby tribes were led by a chief named Massasoit. Samoset had learned some limited English by interacting with English explorers, fishermen, and trappers. He knew of another Native American named Squanto who spoke even better English. Squanto had been kidnapped by Englishmen years earlier and was taken to Europe as a slave. He had returned to America as a guide for another English explorer and was adopted into Massasoit's tribe. Samoset arranged for a meeting between the Pilgrims and Massasoit's people, including Squanto. Massasoit and the governor of Plymouth, John Carver, agreed upon a treaty and became allies. Squanto remained with the Pilgrims in Plymouth and helped them to learn to survive and thrive in the difficult Massachusetts terrain. When its crew had sufficiently recovered, the Mayflower returned to England. Governor Carver died, and William Bradford was elected to serve as the new governor. Massasoit sent several other Native American tribes to make peace treaties with the Pilgrims. After a long year filled with discouragement, fear, suffering, and death, the Pilgrims' future was finally starting to brighten. With Squanto's help, the Pilgrims were able to enjoy a successful harvest in the fall of 1621. They invited Massasoit and his men to join them for a harvest festival. During a 3-day feast, the Pilgrims and Indians enjoyed deer, wild turkey, waterfowl, fish, and other foods. This festival is commemorated today as the first Thanksgiving. Governor William Bradford wrote, "They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, at which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck a meal a week to a person, or now since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned, but true reports."